The next bit of cartographic content that I want to go through with you and have a little discussion on is the issue of classifying data both for choropleth maps and also for graduated symbol maps. So these are maps where we are going to either vary the color of an area or the size of a point symbol based on a bunch of data that we have. The first question to ask yourself is, what does our data look like and what do we want to accentuate about that data? Do we want to show something that's very high or very low, or the data that's in the middle, or do we just want to have a nice representative spread? There's no simple solution or answer to these questions. We just have to sort of come to the terms with the fact that maps tell various types of lies about the data we're going to show. And what particular lie are we going to tell? Now, of course, we're not actually telling a lie. We don't want to mislead people with a map, but we are going to necessarily leave some things out of a map and some not. And just to give a little bit of an example of that, I brought up in ArcGIS Pro the same data that I'm going to use in the sample project this time around. It is the percentage of vote that is for the Libertarian candidate in the 2014 House race. And this uses something called equal interval classification system, where you just have an equal step, essentially, from one color to another color. The darker color showing where the votes are highest for that candidate. In the next page, I have a whole bunch of different methods that are used. On the upper left-hand corner is the equal interval. But then I have something that's called a Jenks system that uses natural breaks in the data. And then I have a couple of others. This includes one that uses a geometrical interval system and another that uses standard deviation. And you can see there's really a big difference that takes place in the color scheme that occurs just by changing the classification system. And we haven't even changed things like the coloring here. Imagine if we reversed the color for these. So these are things that you're going to need to think about. You're going to need to inspect your data a little bit and think about what it is you want to show before you choose one of your classification systems in the project. The color and classification systems can obviously tell a story that you want to. So the data that are represented in this ArcGIS Pro map show the percentage of people that voted for President Trump versus other candidates in the 2020 election. But what I've done is I've used a standard deviation classification system, and the dark blue systems are those areas in which a standard deviation was greater than what you would expect to find in a normalized set of data. So these voting precincts right here are voting precincts, if they're dark blue, that show a significant number of or percentage of votes for President Trump over other candidates. Actually, I think it's for President Biden over others. I'm sorry that I misspoke there. But you get the idea. This map is going to be able to make an argument sort of about the geographic distribution of votes for President Biden or not, whatever it might be. And I've actually accentuated the blue colors, and I've made the lighter blue colors more opaque so that they wouldn't show up as well. And you can do the same sort of things as well. If we wanted to make an argument about areas that you could target for support for financial contributions or something like that to President Biden, this might be the sort of map that you were making. This is an interesting map that uses something called Bivariate Mapping. And again, I've used ArcGIS Pro for it simply because it's really easy to just make changes in the data very quickly, something that's a little bit harder to do with Map Publisher. But the Map Publisher map is much better looking, as you'll see when we get into the process of making that. But I have two sets of data being mapped here. One is the percentage of votes for President Trump, and the other is the percentage of votes for the Libertarian candidate in the House. The dark blue areas show where both President Trump and the Libertarian received an exceptional number of votes compared to votes for either another candidate or for President Biden, as the case may be. Again, this is an interesting map, a little bit hard to interpret and hard to use, but you can get a good sense for how very dark colors really pop out here and can really help us to identify those places that might be more likely to vote on the right side or the libertarian side of the political spectrum. Again, it depends entirely on what we're trying to map. Of course, once we've mapped the data, we have to think pretty carefully about what the legend is going to be. And the legend that pops up immediately for data like this or the other maps that I showed you, if we're using ArcGIS Pro, looks like what we see in the upper left-hand corner here. It doesn't make a lot of sense and might not make a lot of sense to a standard viewer that's looking at the map. Legends have to be truthful, but they also have to really guide the reader to understand what it is that they're looking at. And so what I've done in this legend right here is, instead of using some of the data categories and names for it, and even using the term standard deviation here, I have changed them to say much less than average or much more than average, something that could be more readily understood by a common everyday viewer of the map. So again, these are just some things to think about as you are working on your maps, as you start to make legends, but more importantly, as you start to think about classifying your data. And as always, happy to clarify any questions you might have.